I'll rewrite this historical narrative for you, maintaining all the details while presenting them in a different voice and style. Over the Tunisian desert on that first day of February in 1943, Lieutenant Harry Newsell was bent over his navigation charts at 20,000 feet, working out the numbers that would guide them safely home from Tunis. Through the fog of condensation gathering on his oxygen mask, he calculated they had just 17 minutes before they'd be out of reach of enemy fighters. 17 minutes until they could breathe a little easier. Then the tail gunner's voice cut through the intercom static with words that made every man's blood run cold. Fighters closing fast, 12 o'clock high. Newsell barely had time to register the warning before a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard filled the aircraft. Not the expected crack of gunfire or the blast of an explosion, but something he'd later struggle to describe in letters home. A swoosh, he'd write, followed by a tremendous jarring impact, and then a whoomp that seemed to shake reality itself. Looking up through the plexiglass nose of their Boeing bomber, All-American 3, Newsell watched pieces of a German Messerschmitt tumbling past in surreal slow motion. Wings, fuselage chunks, even the canopy with its iron cross-marking spinning away toward the Sahara 5 miles below. The fighter hadn't been blown apart by their guns in any conventional sense. It had physically crashed into them, and somehow their bomber was still in the air. None of the 10 men aboard could have known they'd just become part of aviation history. Their aircraft was flying with damage that defied every principle of aerodynamics, the tail section barely hanging on by a few metal strips and thin aluminum skin. Within the hour, a photograph would be taken that would become one of the war's most studied images. Engineers and pilots would spend decades trying to understand how they'd survived. The mathematics said they should already be spiraling toward the desert in pieces, yet First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, gripping the controls with the determination he'd learned as Duke University's legendary halfback in their undefeated 1938 season, was keeping 65,000 pounds of crippled aluminum airborne. This would become the most improbable survival story in aerial warfare history, forcing the German Air Force to completely reassess their understanding of American bomber capabilities. The engines had roared to life before dawn at Biskra airfield in Algeria, their right cyclones vibrating through the desert sand that had worked its way into every crack and corner of the base. February 1st had arrived with perfect clarity. No sandstorms, minimal winds, unlimited visibility. During the pre-dawn briefing at 0400 hours, the operations officer had called it perfect bombing weather. Running his hands over the control surfaces during his pre-flight check, First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd proven himself repeatedly. At 25, newspapers back in Savannah still talked about his performance with Duke's Iron Dukes, that team that went undefeated and unscored upon in regular season play. That mental toughness, that absolute refusal to accept defeat regardless of the odds, had served him well since trading his football cleats for flight boots. The Boeing bomber they called All-American 3, serial number 41-24406, had been Bragg's aircraft since late August of 1942. He knew every rivet, every quirk, every sound she made. Built at Boeing's Seattle plant, she'd crossed the Atlantic as part of the massive aerial reinforcement of the European theatre. The ground crew had painted her name in bold letters on the nose, the third aircraft to bear that hopeful designation after her predecessors had been lost to the war's hazards. Technical Sergeant Joe James, who would man the top turret once they reached enemy territory, reported that she was running smooth as silk. James had the kind of mechanical intuition that separated good engineers from great ones, and if he said the ship was ready, you could bank on it. The crew gathering that morning represented the peculiar democracy of America's war effort, men from vastly different backgrounds, united by training and purpose. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel came from Connecticut banking money. Navigator Harry Newsell had left his engineering studies at the University of Minnesota to join up. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge had earned his wings before Pearl Harbor, making him one of the most experienced men aboard despite being only 23. The enlisted men brought their own expertise. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Paul Galloway had mastered the temperamental liaison radios connecting bomber formations. Waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Michael Zuck and Sergeant Elton Conder, the latter a last-minute substitution for a sick crew member from another squadron, checked and rechecked their 50 caliber Brownings. In the tail, Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolus, who would soon earn the nickname Lonesome Sam for reasons that would become terrifyingly clear, settled into his isolated position with the stoicism of a man who'd accepted being the bomber's most vulnerable defender. The 97th Bombardment Group had been the first American heavy bomber unit to see combat in Europe, flying their initial mission from England in mid-August 1942. Since relocating to North Africa as part of the invasion to support the ground campaign driving Axis forces from the continent, the group had already paid a heavy price in aircraft and crews lost to fighters, flak, and the brutal mathematics of strategic bombing. The target for this mission represented a critical node in the German supply system. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte were lifelines for enemy forces in North Africa. Every ton of supplies reaching these ports extended Axis resistance. Every successful bomb run brought the Allies closer to clearing the continent and opening the door to invading southern Europe. The formation assembled over the Mediterranean with practiced precision. 12 flying fortresses from the 414th Bombardment Squadron formed their defensive box pattern, a three-dimensional arrangement designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire from their machine guns. All American 3 took her position on the right wing of the lead aircraft, Flaming Mamie, commanded by Major Robert Coulter, the squadron operations officer. The absence of fighter escort hung over the formation like a dark cloud. The twin-engine Lightning fighters that should have been weaving protective patterns around them were grounded with mechanical problems. The bombers would have to rely on their own guns and the theory of mutual protection that hadn't yet been truly tested against determined opposition. At 20,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Ice formed on windows and the crew's breath froze inside oxygen masks, requiring constant breaking away of ice crystals that could block airflow. The electrically heated flight suits fought a losing battle against the Arctic conditions. Men would return from missions with frostbite rivaling their combat wounds. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge announced target in sight as Tunis materialized through scattered clouds below. The port bristled with activity, ships unloading supplies, trains waiting on sidings, trucks streaming toward the front lines where the Afrika Korps was making its last stand. The bomb run required absolute precision. For 3 minutes, the aircraft had to fly straight and level with no evasive action, while Burbridge synchronized his Norden bomb sight with the target below. The secret device, which Americans guarded so carefully it was removed from aircraft after every mission, used complex gyroscopes and mechanical calculations to determine the exact release point. Flak was already coming up. Everyone could see the black puffs blossoming around them, each one representing hundreds of shrapnel pieces seeking aluminum and flesh. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed as anti-tank weapons, had proven devastatingly effective against bombers. Each shell was fused to explode at a predetermined altitude, creating a box of death that bombers had to fly through. Burbridge announced bombs away, and all American 3 lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives fell from her bomb bay. Below, the port erupted in smoke and flame. Direct hits on warehouses, secondary explosions from stored ammunition, ships listing at their moorings. A good strike, maybe their best yet. But celebration was short-lived. As the formation turned west toward home, the fighters appeared. Multiple gunners simultaneously shouted warnings about bandits at 2 o'clock high, Messerschmitt 109s. 2 German fighters dove from their perch in the sun. The pilots had learned from hard experience that flying fortress defensive fire was weakest from the front. The nose guns couldn't depress enough to hit fighters coming in low, and the top turret couldn't traverse fast enough to track a high-speed frontal approach. The first fighter, piloted by a German officer named Julius Meinberg, temporarily attached to a fighter wing, opened fire at 500 yards. His 20mm cannons and machine guns sparkled along his wings as he pumped rounds into flaming Mamie. The lead bomber shuddered under the impact, pieces of aluminum peeling away like confetti. The second fighter, flown by Feldwebel Erich Paxia, with 16 confirmed victories to his credit, bore in on All-American 3. Paxia was no novice. He'd earned the honor goblet awarded to successful fighter pilots and knew exactly where to aim to kill pilots, cripple engines, or hit fuel tanks in the wing routes. But something went wrong. At 300 yards, Paxia should have begun his escape maneuver, a half-roll that would take him under the bomber and out of the defensive fire. It was a move he'd executed dozens of times. But this time, whether from overconfidence, target fixation, or mechanical failure, he started the maneuver too late. Or perhaps, and here the historical record becomes crucial, he didn't start it at all because he was already dead. Burbridge would later recall having him in his sights, seeing the pilot's face through the windscreen as he came straight at them. Then the top turret opened up. James had him too. The fighter jerked like someone had yanked it with a string and started this lazy roll to the right. Technical Sergeant Joe James, manning the twin 50s in the top turret, had put a burst directly into the cockpit. At least one round, possibly more, had found Erich Paxia. Whether he died instantly or was merely incapacitated, the effect was the same. 2,000 pounds of fighter aircraft, travelling at over 350 miles per hour, was suddenly without conscious control. What happened next occurred in less than 2 seconds, but would be analysed for decades. The uncontrolled fighter sliced into All-American 3 just aft of the waist gun positions. The German fighter's left wing cut through the bomber's fuselage like a sword through paper, creating a diagonal gash running from the base of the vertical stabilizer across to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed. Navigator Harry Newessel's contemporary account, written to his brother within days, provides the most visceral description. "The fighter hit them with a swoosh and a bang that shook the whole ship," he wrote. Looking back through the companionway, he couldn't believe what he saw. Daylight where there should have been airplane. The physics of the impact defied comprehension. The fighter's wing travelling at nearly 400 miles per hour relative velocity should have cut the bomber completely in half. Instead, by mere chance, or what many crew members would later call divine intervention, the fighter's wing missed the main structural spars on the right side of the fuselage by inches. The tail section, containing Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolus, remained attached by what investigators would later describe as the absolute minimum structural connection necessary to maintain any control authority. The German fighter disintegrated. Its wing remained partially embedded in the bomber's fuselage. The engine and forward fuselage tumbled away in a ball of flame. The tail section, with its distinctive markings, spun like a maple seed toward the desert below. Inside that burning wreckage was Feldwebel Erich Paxia, born in May 1918, who would be posthumously awarded his honor goblet on the 1st of March, never knowing his death had created one of aviation's most remarkable survival stories. The crew of All-American 3 had no time to contemplate their attacker's fate. They had problems of their own, problems that by all laws of physics and aerodynamics should have been insurmountable. Bragg's voice over the intercom was steady as he called for crew check-in, betraying none of the physical strain of wrestling with controls that had suddenly gone mushy and unresponsive. The control cables to the tail surfaces, the elevator and rudder that allowed the pilot to control pitch and direction, had been severed or severely damaged. The aircraft wanted to nose down into what pilots called a graveyard spiral. One by one, the crew checked in. Miraculously, no one had been injured in the collision itself. But when it came time for the tail gunner to report, the intercom remained silent. Bragg called for Sarpolus. "Sam, you okay back there?" Still nothing. The interphone line to the tail position had been cut, but through the jagged hole in the fuselage, the waist gunners could see movement in the tail section. Sam Sarpalus was alive, trapped in a tail section moving independently from the rest of the aircraft, swaying with each air current like, as one crew member described it, a kite on a string in a hurricane. The full extent of the damage was staggering. The left horizontal stabilizer was completely gone, shorn off by the fighter's wing. The elevator on that side had vanished with it. The vertical stabilizer had a massive gash through its base. The fuselage itself was opened like a tin can from the tail gunner's position, forward to just behind the waist gun windows. Control cables hung loose in the slipstream. Hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines. Lieutenant Charles Cutforth, navigator aboard a nearby bomber, managed to maneuver close enough to take a photograph that would become one of the war's most famous images. In it, the tail section of All-American 3 is clearly offset from normal alignment, canted at an angle suggesting imminent structural failure. The diagonal slash through the fuselage is visible along with the missing stabilizer. The fact that the aircraft is maintaining level flight seems to violate fundamental laws of physics. Someone breathed over the intercom that the whole back end was about to come off. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel worked frantically with Bragg to find some combination of control inputs that would keep them airborne. With traditional control surfaces compromised, they had to innovate. The autopilot system connected to the Norden bomb site used electrical servos rather than mechanical cables. By engaging it partially, they could provide some stability. Differential engine power, running the left engines at higher power than the right, could help counteract the tendency to yaw. But every input had to be gentle and measured. Too much force on any control and the tail might simply tear away. Major Coulter's voice crackled over the radio from Flaming Mamie, which had also been badly damaged in the fighter attack, asking if they could make it home. Bragg looked at the fuel gauges. No major leaks, tanks still reading adequate reserves. All 4 engines running, temperatures and pressures normal. The only thing wrong with the aircraft was that it was missing a significant portion of its structure. A minor detail, really. Bragg responded that they were going to try. In the nearly severed tail section, Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpalus faced a decision that would have paralysed most men. He could stay where he was hoping the tail would hold until landing, or attempt to crawl forward through the damaged fuselage to the relative safety of the main aircraft body. The tail section was moving independently, sometimes feet out of alignment with the rest of the aircraft. Each movement stressed the few remaining connections. Any sudden manoeuvre, any strong turbulence, and he would be riding tons of aluminum to his death. Sarpalus made his choice. Gathering his chest parachute, his equipment, and in a detail that would become legend, a borrowed jacket belonging to Lieutenant Bragg, he began the most dangerous 30 feet he would ever travel. The scene inside the fuselage was apocalyptic. Daylight streamed through tears in the aluminum skin. Wind howled through the gaps, creating a maelstrom of loose equipment, spent shell casings, and debris from the German fighter. The fuselage floor, never designed to support weight without the surrounding structure, flexed dangerously under his hands and knees. One wrong move, one failure of the overstressed aluminum, and he would fall through into 5 miles of empty air. Waist gunner Michael Zuck watched Sarpalus's approach with a combination of admiration and disbelief. He would later recall that Sam came crawling through that mess like it was a Sunday stroll, calm as could be, dragging his gear behind him. When he finally made it to them, first thing he did was hand the lieutenant's jacket over and say to make sure the skipper got it back. He might need it when they landed. The journey that should have taken seconds had taken nearly 10 minutes, but Sam Sarpalus had made it. All 10 crew members were now in the forward section of the aircraft, should they need to bail out. The bomber formation faced a terrible decision. Standard procedure dictated that damaged aircraft that couldn't keep pace should be left behind. They endangered the entire formation by forcing it to slow down and become more vulnerable to fighter attack. But the crews of the 414th Squadron weren't about to abandon All-American 3. The formation closed ranks around the wounded bomber, creating a defensive shield with their massed firepower. It meant accepting greater risk for themselves, flying slower, maintaining formation longer, staying in enemy airspace precious minutes more than necessary. But these were men who had trained together, lived together in the harsh conditions of North African bases, and lost friends together. The arithmetic of survival took second place to loyalty. The formation commander radioed that they were staying with them until they were clear of fighter range to keep her steady. The German fighters, seeing the tight defensive formation and perhaps low on fuel and ammunition, eventually turned away. They had claimed their victories, or so they thought. Julius Meinberg would survive the day despite suffering severe burns when defensive fire ignited his oxygen system. In his post-war memoir, he would claim a flying fortress kill from this engagement. He was half right. Flaming Mamie would indeed go down with Major Coulter and 6 crew members killed, but all American 3 refused to die. As the formation finally crossed into Allied-controlled airspace, the other bombers began peeling away, waggling their wings in salute as they headed for Biskra. All American 3, flying at reduced speed to minimize stress on the damaged structure, would make the journey alone. The flight from the target area to Biskra should have taken an hour. For all American 3 fighting to stay airborne, it would take 90 minutes that felt like 90 years. Every air pocket, every bit of turbulence sent shudders through the aircraft that made the crew hold their breath. The tail section continued its independent movement, sometimes aligned with the fuselage, sometimes canted at angles that defied belief. Bragg and Engel developed a rhythm, a delicate dance with the dying aircraft. Gentle pressure on the yoke, never sudden movements. Adjust the throttles incrementally, feel the aircraft's response, adjust again. They flew more by instinct than instruments, sensing through their hands and feet what the aircraft could tolerate. Flight engineer Joe James monitored the engines obsessively. Number 3 was running slightly hot, possibly from debris damage, but still within acceptable limits. Oil pressure steady on all 4. Fuel consumption actually improved due to their reduced speed. The Wright Cyclone radials, built in factories across America by workers who would never know how their precision saved lives, continued their steady thunder. Bragg asked the navigator how far to base. Harry Newsell had been continuously calculating and recalculating their position. The damage had affected the aircraft's trim, causing it to fly slightly sideways in what pilots called a crab. This affected both their speed and fuel consumption, but his calculations showed they would make it, albeit with minimal reserves. 40 minutes, he reported. Weather was still clear at base. Radio operator Paul Galloway had been in constant contact with Biskra Tower, updating them on the aircraft's condition. The base had mobilized every available emergency vehicle. Ambulances, fire trucks, and crash crews lined the runway. The base commander himself had come to the tower to monitor the situation. The crew went through landing preparation with mechanical precision, each man checking and rechecking their equipment. They kept their parachutes on. If the tails separated during landing, they might have seconds to evacuate. Waist gunners Zuck and Conda cleared loose equipment that could become projectiles in a crash. Bombardier Burbridge secured the bomb site. Everyone found something to hold on to. Bragg called Biskra Tower 5 minutes out, requesting straight-in approach on runway 27. Tower cleared them for immediate approach with emergency vehicles standing by, asking how many wounded aboard. Bragg and Engel exchanged glances. By all rights they should all be dead, yet here they were, 10 men without a scratch among them, at least not from the collision. Tower was told no wounded, just structural damage. Through the windscreen, the brown expanse of Biskra airfield materialized from the desert haze. Home, safety, solid ground, the most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen. Engel announced gear coming down, moving the lever. The landing gear operated on a separate hydraulic system from the control surfaces, and to everyone's relief they heard and felt the reassuring thunk of wheels locking into position. 3 green lights on the panel. The gear was down and locked. Engel asked about flaps. Bragg considered. Flaps would slow them down for landing, but would also change the airflow over the tail, potentially adding stress to the damaged structure. No flaps, he decided. They would come in hot and use the whole runway. The approach required every ounce of skill Bragg had developed in hundreds of hours of flight training. The aircraft didn't want to fly straight. It wanted to yaw, to roll, to pitch down. Every correction required an opposite correction, a constant battle against aerodynamic forces that should have won 80 miles ago. 1 mile out, half a mile. The runway rushed up to meet them, wider and more welcome than any runway had ever been. Ground crews lined the taxiways, watching in stunned silence as the impossible aircraft made its final approach. Some would later say they could see daylight through the fuselage from a quarter-mile away. The main wheels kissed the sand-swept runway at 110 miles per hour, faster than normal but as gently as Bragg could manage. The aircraft settled, and for a moment it seemed the landing would be textbook perfect. Then physics reasserted itself. Without the tail wheel, which had been destroyed in the collision, the tail section dropped to the runway surface. The aircraft became a 65,000-pound sled grinding down the runway in a shower of sparks and aluminum fragments. The sound was indescribable, metal on concrete, a shriek that could be heard miles away. Bragg and Engel stood on the brakes fighting to keep the aircraft straight as it decelerated. Without the tail wheel and with compromised rudder control, any deviation from straight ahead could cause a ground loop that would certainly tear the aircraft apart. 100 yards, 200, 300. The aircraft finally ground to a stop, sitting at an awkward angle with its tail on the runway and its nose pointed skyward. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, as if on signal, all 10 crew members scrambled for the exits. They assembled on the runway, looking back at their aircraft in disbelief. The damage was even worse than they had imagined. The tail section hung at an impossible angle connected to the fuselage by what appeared to be strips of aluminum no thicker than heavy paper. How it had held together for 90 minutes of flight was beyond comprehension. The flight surgeon rushed up with his medical team, but Bragg told him they were all fine, not a scratch. The doctor looked from the crew to the aircraft and back again, his expression suggesting he was witnessing either a miracle or mass hallucination. What happened next would become part of the legend, told and retold in ready rooms across the theatre. 3 ground crew members from another squadron, curious about the damage, climbed aboard All-American 3 to get a closer look. They made their way aft, peering through the gash in the fuselage, marvelling at the destruction. Their combined weight, perhaps 500 pounds, was the final straw. With a grinding, tearing sound of overstressed metal finally giving way, the tail section separated completely from the fuselage and collapsed onto the runway. The 3 airmen scrambled clear, white-faced and shaking, suddenly understanding just how close to death the aircrew had been for the past 90 minutes. Master Sergeant Hank Hyland, the crew chief responsible for All-American 3, walked slowly around the wreckage, taking notes on a clipboard. His job would be to determine if the aircraft could be repaired or should be written off as a total loss. It was a question that should have been academic. No aircraft this badly damaged could ever fly again. But this was 1943, and America was producing flying fortresses at a rate that seemed impossible to everyone except the Americans themselves. In Seattle, Burbank, and Long Beach, workers were completing a new bomber every few hours. The production lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, staffed by men too old or too young for military service and by women who had never seen the inside of a factory before Pearl Harbor. Hyland looked at the serial number painted on the tail. This aircraft had already survived more than any machine should be asked to endure. Perhaps she had one more miracle left in her. Conventional wisdom said All-American 3 was finished, the damage too extensive, structural integrity too compromised. In any other air force, she would have been cannibalized for spare parts and the remainder scrapped. But the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 operated on a different philosophy. If it could be fixed, it would be fixed. Master Sergeant Hyland and the men of the Air Service Squadron spent 6 weeks performing what could only be described as major surgery. They found a tail section from another bomber that had been damaged beyond repair in a landing accident. Using techniques more suited to a shipyard than an aircraft maintenance facility, they grafted the salvaged tail onto All-American 3. The work was meticulous and exhausting. Every rivet had to be perfect, every control cable properly tensioned, every electrical connection tested and retested. The men worked in desert heat that could reach 120 degrees, then through desert nights when temperature would plummet toward freezing. They worked because every repaired aircraft meant one more bomber to strike at the enemy, one step closer to ending the war. The repair wasn't to factory standards. The aircraft would never be the same, slower, less responsive, prone to vibrations that hadn't existed before. But on May 10th of 1943, All-American 3 flew again, carrying another crew on a mission. The ground crews watched her take off with mixture of pride and apprehension. They had brought her back from the dead, but would she hold together? She did. All-American 3 would continue flying missions, though relegated to less demanding roles, transport flights, training missions, runs to areas where fighter opposition was unlikely. She had earned the right to an easier life. On March 6th of 1945, at an airfield in Italy, she was finally retired and salvaged, her war over at last. Research into the identity of the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 reveals a young man whose story intersected with history in the most violent way possible. Feldwebel Erich Paxier was 24 years old on February 1st of 1943, just a year younger than Kendrick Bragg. Born in May 1918, he had grown up in a Germany transformed by the regime, trained in glider clubs, secretly preparing pilots for an air force that wasn't supposed to exist under treaty restrictions. By early 1943, Paxier had proven himself an exceptional fighter pilot. His 16 confirmed victories placed him among successful but not legendary aces, men who did their job with skill and professionalism but whose names wouldn't be celebrated in propaganda broadcasts. He flew with one of the most successful fighter wings in the German Air Force, credited with over 4,000 Allied aircraft destroyed during the war. The fighter he flew that day represented the latest evolution of a revolutionary design. Powered by an engine producing 1,475 horsepower, armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and machine guns in the nose, it was a formidable opponent for any Allied aircraft. In the hands of an experienced pilot like Paxier, it should have been more than a match for a lumbering bomber. But the calculus of aerial combat is unforgiving. One moment of inattention, one bullet in the wrong place, and experience becomes irrelevant. The burst from Technical Sergeant Joe James's twin 50s found its mark, and Erich Paxier's war ended in an instant. His body was recovered from the wreckage and buried at a German war cemetery in Tunisia, where it remains to this day. On March 1st of 1943, Paxier was posthumously awarded the Honor Goblet, recognizing his achievements as a fighter pilot. The citation made no mention of the collision, only noting he had died in aerial combat against enemy bombers. His family would receive the traditional letter from his commanding officer expressing regret and praising his service. They would never know their son's death had created one of the most remarkable survival stories in aviation history. The survival of All-American 3 became a case study for Boeing engineers and Army Air Force's technical analysts. How had an aircraft missing critical structural components managed to fly for 90 minutes? The answer lay in revolutionary design philosophy that had created the flying fortress. Unlike previous bombers, which relied on a single main spar running through wing and fuselage, the design used semi-monocoque construction. Strength came not from a single component, but from the entire structure working together. The wing itself carried loads reinforced by frames and stringers that distributed stress throughout the airframe. When primary load paths failed, secondary and even tertiary paths could, under the right circumstances, carry enough load to maintain structural integrity. The key to All-American 3's survival was what hadn't been damaged. The wing-to-fuselage junction, the strongest point on the aircraft, remained intact. The main wing spars carrying the weight of 4 engines and fuel tanks were undamaged. The bomb bay area, with its robust construction necessary to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance, provided a rigid box that held forward and aft sections together, even when connecting structure was compromised. A Boeing engineer reviewing the incident reports noted the aircraft had been designed with combat damage in mind from the beginning. They knew these aircraft would take hits, he wrote in a technical memorandum. They built in redundancy wherever possible, multiple control cables, backup hydraulic systems, structural members that could carry loads even when their neighbours failed. The fact this aircraft survived such extreme damage validates every extra pound of structure they included. The electrical system played a crucial role in survival. While mechanical control cables were severed or damaged, electrical wires running to autopilot servos remained partially functional. This allowed Bragg and Engel to maintain some control authority through the bomb site's autopilot system, a capability that hadn't been designed for this purpose but proved invaluable. The survival sent ripples through both Allied and Axis air forces. For American bomber crews, it became a morale-boosting legend told in briefing rooms from England to Italy. If All American 3 could make it home with half her tail shot off, surely their damaged aircraft could make it too. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Crews flew with greater confidence, knowing their bombers could absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. The squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident, reference to the phrase coming in on a wing and a prayer, though the famous song of that title was actually written about another aircraft. The association with All American 3 became permanent in squadron lore. For the Germans, the incident reinforced growing concerns about American industrial capability. Officials responsible for aircraft production had already warned about strategic implications of American bomber production. "The Americans are building bombers like we build cars," one told a conference of fighter commanders. "No, faster than we build cars, and these bombers are not fragile, they are flying tanks." The tactical implications were significant. Doctrine had assumed catastrophic structural damage would destroy any bomber. Pilots were trained to aim for critical points, cockpits, engines, bomb bays, where a few well-placed cannon shells should prove fatal. But incidents like All American 3 proved even perfect shots might not bring down a flying fortress. A pilot who would become one of the highest-scoring aces in history wrote about the frustration of attacking these bombers. "You would attack, score hits, see pieces flying off and watch the bomber continue flying," he wrote. "You would attack again, expend all your ammunition, and still it flew." Sometimes you wondered if American bombers were protected by supernatural forces. The Germans began developing new tactics, attacking from the front where defensive armament was weakest, concentrating multiple fighters on single bombers, developing heavier weapons specifically for bomber destruction. The 30mm cannon firing explosive shells that could blow meter-wide holes in bomber structures was a direct response to flying fortress durability. The 10 men who survived the impossible flight would carry the experience for the rest of their lives, each processing it in their own way. Their story, verified by contemporary documents and eyewitness accounts, stands as one of the most thoroughly documented incidents in World War II aviation history. First Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg would complete his tour of duty and return to the United States, where he served as an instructor pilot, teaching new bomber crews skills that might one day save their lives. He rarely spoke about February 1st of 1943, even to his family. When pressed, he would simply say they were lucky. Good airplane, good crew, lucky. He died in October 1999 at age 81, taking with him the full measure of what it felt like to fly an aircraft that shouldn't have been flyable. Navigator Harry Newessel's letter home, written within days of the incident, provides the most contemporary account of the event. The letter, preserved with all crew members' signatures, captures the immediate aftermath before time, and retelling could alter details. "I still can't believe we made it," he wrote. "When I looked back and saw daylight through the airplane, I thought we were finished, but Bragg and Engel kept her flying. I don't know how, but they did." Neuessel would pass away in June 1991 at age 74. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge became the crew's unofficial historian, spending decades correcting myths that accumulated around their story. In interviews conducted near the end of his life, he systematically debunked embellishments. No, they hadn't used parachute cords to hold the plane together. No, they hadn't completed their bomb run after the collision. It happened on the way home. No, they weren't headed for England, but back to their base in Algeria. Burbridge understood the true story was remarkable enough without exaggeration. He died in February 2013 at age 92, one of the last surviving witnesses to that day over Tunisia. Godfrey Engel returned to Connecticut after the war, rarely speaking of his military service. Those who knew him said he would sometimes unconsciously move his hands as if working aircraft controls, especially during thunderstorms. He lived until May 2007, dying at age 92 with his family around him. Technical Sergeant Joe James, whose guns had killed Eric Paxia and precipitated the collision, struggled with the complexity of his role in the event. He had saved his crew by shooting down an attacking fighter, but that action had led to a collision that nearly killed them all. The paradox haunted him. "I did my job," he would say when asked. "That's all any of us did, our job." The waist gunners, Michael Zuck and Elton Conda, maintained that watching Sam Sarpolus crawl through the destroyed fuselage was the bravest thing they witnessed in the war. "We saw a lot of brave men do brave things," Zuck said in an interview years later. "But Sam crawling through that mess calm as could be, that was something special." Staff Sergeant Sam Sarpolus himself, Lonesome Sam, who had ridden the severed tail section, became something of a legend. His matter-of-fact courage, exemplified by his concern for returning Bragg's jacket, represented the kind of unflappable determination that characterized the best of American aircrew. "What else was I going to do?" he said when asked about his crawl through the damaged fuselage. "Sit there and wait to fall out of the sky. Better to die trying than die waiting." Radio operator Paul Galloway would note that maintaining communication with the base during the return flight was one of the hardest things he ever did. "Every time the plane lurched, I thought we were coming apart," he recalled, "and I kept transmitting our position, keeping my voice steady. If we went down, I wanted them to know where to find us." The photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cutforth from a nearby bomber became one of World War II's most analysed images. It shows All-American 3 in profile against the North African desert, the damage to her tail section clearly visible. The image would be studied by engineers, pilots and historians for decades, each searching for clues to explain the impossible. What the photograph reveals is both devastating damage and improbable survival. The left horizontal stabilizer is completely gone, the vertical stabilizer shows a massive diagonal gash, the fuselage is opened from the tail gunner's position forward. The original authenticated photograph needs no embellishment. It captures a moment that shouldn't exist, an aircraft flying despite damage that exceeds all design tolerances, all safety margins, all reasonable expectations. It is visual proof of what 10 men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would call divine intervention. The incident occurred at a crucial juncture in the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, once seemingly invincible, was being squeezed between forces advancing from the east and American forces pushing from the west. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte, the targets of that day's mission, were vital lifelines for Axis forces. Every successful bombing mission hastened the inevitable surrender. Within 3 months of All-American 3's miraculous return, Axis forces in North Africa would capitulate. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in a defeat comparable to their losses in Russia in its impact on military capability. The bombers, including the repaired All-American 3, had played their part in this victory. The Flying Fortress would go on to become the most iconic American bomber of the war. Though another type was produced in greater numbers and could carry a heavier bomb load farther, it was this aircraft that captured public imagination. Its ability to absorb punishment and bring crews home became legendary. By war's end, these bombers had dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. But the cost was staggering. Of over 12,000 produced, nearly 5,000 were lost in combat. Each loss represented 10 young men who wouldn't come home. The survival rate for bomber crews was among the lowest in the military. Completion of a tour was considered beating the odds. The miracle of All-American 3 stood in stark contrast to the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. Aviation engineers studying the incident have provided valuable insights into how the aircraft managed to survive. Analysis suggests the aircraft was operating at the absolute margins of controllability. The center of gravity had shifted dramatically aft due to lost structure, putting the aircraft into a condition that would challenge even modern flight control systems. Key factors in survival were structural redundancy. The design included multiple load paths for critical forces. When primary structures failed, secondary systems never intended to carry full loads managed to hold just enough to maintain basic integrity. Speed reduction, by immediately reducing airspeed. Bragg minimized aerodynamic forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. Every mile per hour of speed reduction decreased stress on damaged structure exponentially. Gentle control inputs, the relatively smooth air over the North African desert, meant no severe turbulence to stress the damaged structure. Had they encountered a thunderstorm or severe turbulence, the aircraft would not have survived. The engineering community continues to study this incident as an example of how robust design and skilled piloting can combine to achieve seemingly impossible outcomes. Lessons learned influenced post-war aircraft design. What official records don't capture is the impact such incidents had on German fighter morale. Young pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time by 1943, were told American bombers were easy targets, slow and vulnerable. Then they would attack these easy targets and watch them absorb incredible damage and keep flying. Officers who developed head-on attack tactics that would become standard doctrine wrote about discovering that destroying a flying fortress required an average of 20 direct hits from 20mm cannon shells. Even then you would see them fly away, he noted. This was not what we had been told to expect. The production of the bomber by 3 separate manufacturers achieved statistics that remain staggering even by today's standards. At peak production, they were completing 16 aircraft every day. The workforce included thousands of women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war, yet they achieved quality standards that would be challenging today with computer-controlled machinery. Over the decades, the story has accumulated layers of myth and exaggeration. Various retellings have added dramatic elements that never occurred, the crew using parachute cords to hold the plane together, completing their bombing run after the collision, flying all the way to England, the tail gunner being rescued mid-flight. These embellishments, while dramatic, actually diminish the true achievement. The reality verified by contemporary documents, crew testimony, and photographic evidence needs no exaggeration. 10 men flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft 90 minutes and 150 miles to safety through skill, determination, and teamwork. They did it without losing a single crew member. They did it in an aircraft that had no business flying, but somehow forgot to fall from the sky. Ralph Burbridge, who spent his later years correcting the record, understood this. "The true story is amazing enough," he said in his final interview. "We don't need to make things up. What happened that day was impossible, but we did it anyway. That's the story that should be told." The squadron would fly 178 combat missions during the war, losing 85 aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. But no story from their combat records matched All-American 3 for sheer impossibility. The incident became part of squadron identity, a touchstone story that defined what they were capable of achieving. The squadron's new emblem, inspired by the incident, showed a puppy praying atop a tail section. The choice of a puppy, rather than a more martial symbol, reflected the youth of the aircrew. Most were in their early 20s, their vulnerability in the face of enemy action. Yet the praying attitude suggested both hope and the divine intervention many genuinely believed had saved all American III veterans would gather for reunions decades after the war, and inevitably someone would retell the story of February 1st. Men who had flown their own harrowing missions, who had their own stories of survival against the odds, would listen with respect to the tale of the bomber that refused to die. The German fighter force's encounter with All-American III was part of a learning curve that would drive significant tactical and technical evolution. The Air Force had begun the war with fighters optimized for dogfighting, light maneuverable aircraft with weapons adequate for downing other fighters. The appearance of heavy bombers forced a complete reconsideration. By mid-1943, partially in response to incidents like this, German fighters were being equipped with heavier weapons. A new variant introduced shortly after Tunisia carried a 30mm cannon firing explosive shells capable of blowing meter-wide holes in bomber structures. Another type was modified to carry multiple cannons and even rocket projectiles. All-American III was made possible not just by design, but by an entire industrial ecosystem that supported the aircraft. The engines were built in factories in New Jersey and Ohio. The machine guns came from facilities in Connecticut and Michigan. The aluminum skin was rolled in plants in Tennessee and Washington. The instruments were manufactured in dozens of specialized facilities across the country. This distributed production network meant no single bombing raid. No single sabotage operation could significantly impact production. It also meant improvements and modifications could be rapidly implemented across the network. Lessons learned from combat damage were incorporated into new aircraft within weeks. The scale of American industrial mobilization remains difficult to comprehend. In 1939, the Army Air Corps had 1,700 aircraft total. By 1945, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. The program alone employed over 40,000 workers at one plant, working 3 shifts around the clock. Beyond the technical marvel and strategic implications, the story is fundamentally about 10 young men facing impossible circumstances. They were not professional soldiers, but citizens who had answered their nation's call. Bragg had been a college athlete, Neusel an engineering student. Burbridge had joined before Pearl Harbor simply because he wanted to fly. Their calm professionalism in the face of catastrophic damage speaks to the quality of training. The Army Air Forces had created from scratch the largest and most technically sophisticated air arm the world had ever seen. The theory that heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets without fighter escort was proving costly. But incidents like All-American III provided evidence these aircraft could at least survive the journey home even when severely damaged. This survivability meant experienced crews were more likely to complete their tours, preserving institutional knowledge and improving overall effectiveness. It meant damaged aircraft could be repaired and returned to service rather than being total losses. More importantly, it affected German strategic calculations. If American bombers were this difficult to destroy, and if American industry could produce them faster than Germany could shoot them down, then the mathematics of aerial attrition favored the Allies. This realization contributed to gradual shift of production priorities from offensive to defensive weapons, from bombers to fighters, a shift that would ultimately prove futile. Despite extensive documentation, some aspects of All-American III's survival remain subjects of engineering study. How did the few remaining structural members designed to carry perhaps 20% of the loads they endured hold together for 90 minutes? Why didn't aerodynamic flutter, the destructive vibration that can tear damaged aircraft apart, develop during the return flight? The aircraft appears to have been operating in what engineers call a non-linear regime, a condition where normal aerodynamic rules become unpredictable. The fact the aircraft remained controllable in this regime may have been due to a fortunate combination of factors, the specific damage pattern, atmospheric conditions, and pilot skill all aligning to create a survivable situation against overwhelming odds. In 1985, several surviving crew members gathered for a reunion. Age had silvered their hair and slowed their steps, but when they stood before a bomber on static display, the years fell away. They walked through the aircraft, each remembering their position on that day 42 years earlier. Bragg, then 67, sat in the pilot's seat one more time, his hands automatically finding the control yoke. "She was a good ship," he said quietly. "She brought us home when she had every right to quit on us. You can't ask more than that from an airplane." Burbridge, standing in the bombardier's position in the nose, pointed through the plexiglass. "That's where I saw the fighter coming in, right there, straight at us. I can still see his face sometimes, just before James got him. They signed autographs for aviation enthusiasts who had come to meet the men of All-American 3. They answered questions, posed for photographs, and shared memories. But there were also long silences, moments when each man was back over Tunisia feeling the aircraft shudder from impact, wondering if the next second would be their last. Military historians have placed the incident within the broader context of the air war over Europe and North Africa. The incident exemplifies both the robustness of American bomber design and the courage of the young men who flew them. It demonstrates survival in aerial combat often depended on a combination of good engineering, skilled piloting, and simple luck. The incident also influenced post-war aviation design. The concept of redundancy, of building aircraft that could survive battle damage, became central to military aircraft design. Modern combat aircraft incorporate lessons learned from Flying Fortress combat experience, including multiple hydraulic systems, redundant flight controls, and structural designs that prevent catastrophic failure from localized damage. The statistics of All-American 3's survival remain compelling. 90 minutes flight time from collision to landing, 150 miles distance flown with catastrophic damage, 20,000 feet altitude at impact, 10 men crew members who all survived uninjured, effectively zero structural connection remaining, 6 weeks' time to repair and return to service, one photograph that captured the impossible for history, 16 victories, Eric Paxia's combat record before the collision, the serial number that should have been on a loss report. These numbers tell a story of survival that shouldn't have been possible yet, was meticulously documented and verified. Today, only a handful of these bombers remain airworthy, maintained by dedicated organizations that keep the memory alive. When these aircraft appear at air shows, elderly veterans and aviation enthusiasts gather to see them, to hear the distinctive sound of Wright Cyclone engines, to remember. The story of All-American 3 is told at these gatherings usually by someone who knew someone who was there or who has studied the incident in detail. Young people listen with skepticism, surely the story has been exaggerated. Then they see the photograph, read the crew testimonies, examine the technical reports, the skepticism turns to amazement. The aircraft herself is long gone, scrapped in 1945 after giving everything she had to give. But her story endures in museums, in books, in the memories of an ever-dwindling number of veterans. She has become more than just an aircraft. She has become a symbol of American industrial capability, of aircrew courage, and of the sometimes inexplicable nature of survival in war. In his last interview before his death, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wanted to leave about All-American 3. He thought for a long moment before answering. "We were just doing our job, that's what people today need to understand. We weren't heroes, we were young men far from home doing a job that needed doing. The airplane was built by people doing their job, building the best bomber they could. When we got hit, everyone did their job. Kenny flew, the gunners watched for fighters, I helped navigate, Sam crawled out of the tail. The miracle wasn't that we survived. The miracle was that thousands of people, from the factory workers who built our plane to the ground crews who patched her up, all did their jobs well enough that when everything went wrong, we had a chance. That's the American way, everyone doing their job, and sometimes, when you need it most, it all comes together and works. We flew home in an airplane that couldn't fly, landed a plane that couldn't land, and walked away from what should have been our grave. If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is. The story transcends the boundaries of a simple combat narrative. It represents a moment when the impossible became possible, when engineering excellence met human determination and created an outcome that still challenges understanding of what aircraft can survive. The 10 men who flew home on February 1st of 1943 were carried not just by 4 engines and Boeing aluminum, but by the accumulated expertise of American industry, the training systems, and perhaps something more. Call it luck, fate, or divine intervention. Their survival proved the Flying Fortress had earned its name not through propaganda, but through demonstrated capability. For the Germans who witnessed it, the incident was a glimpse of what they were truly fighting, not just American aircraft, but American industrial might, training systems, and determination. For an Air Force already struggling with the mathematics of attrition, All-American 3 was proof the numbers would never add up in their favor. The photograph taken that day has become one of the iconic images of World War II, but it represents more than just one miraculous survival. It captures the essence of the American air campaign, damaged but still flying, wounded but still fighting, against all odds but still coming home. Kendrick Bragg and his crew didn't set out to make history. They set out to bomb a target and return to base, just another mission in a war that seemed endless. But when disaster struck, when a dying German fighter sliced their aircraft nearly in half, they responded with the kind of quiet professionalism that characterized the best of their generation. They didn't panic, they didn't give up, they simply did what needed to be done. Each man at his position, each doing his job, trusting in their aircraft, their training, and each other. In doing so, they created a story that would outlive them all, a testament to what becomes possible when engineering excellence meets human courage. The Germans were shocked when 2 aircraft became one, when fighter and bomber merged in a violent embrace that should have destroyed both. They were even more shocked when the American bomber, against every law of physics and probability, flew home. It was a preview of American industrial and military capability that would eventually overwhelm the regime. All-American 3 flew home carrying 10 men who should have died but didn't in an aircraft that couldn't fly but did. She carried more than her crew. She carried proof that American bombers were tougher than anyone imagined, that American air crews were equal to any challenge, and that sometimes in war's darkest moments the impossible becomes possible. The tail section that finally fell off after landing, that couldn't support the weight of 3 curious ground crew members, had somehow supported itself in flight for 90 minutes. It remains one of aviation's enduring mysteries, a reminder that human courage and determination can sometimes overcome even the laws of physics. Today, when engineers study the incident, when historians document it, when veterans remember it, they all come to the same conclusion: this shouldn't have been possible. Yet the evidence is incontrovertible. The photographs, the testimonies, the official records all confirm All-American 3 flew home when she should have fallen from the sky. In that impossibility lies the true meaning. It reminds us that in the extremity of human experience, when life and death hang in the balance, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. 10 young Americans in a broken airplane over hostile territory refused to accept defeat. In their refusal, in their determination to survive against impossible odds, they created a legend that will endure as long as people remember the Second World War. They witnessed American engineering at its finest, American airmanship at its best, and American determination at its most indomitable. They witnessed the impossible, and the impossible flew home.